Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It has been a wild week in Canadian politics, and it's only the first full week of 2026. Most of what we've been talking about involves international politics, but there's been a lot to discuss, from the American intervention in Venezuela and its impact on the Canadian energy sector, to more U.S. threats to take over a NATO ally, Greenland, with Prime Minister Mark Carney heading to Paris for a meeting on the peace process for Ukraine, to a potential trip out to China. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney here for the Big Story podcast. We're going to be breaking it all down now with my colleague here in Ottawa, Glen McGregor for CityNews. Glen, thanks very much for joining me.
Always fun to be on here with you, Cormac.
So let's start with the issue that was really dominating as we entered this week, and that was the American intervention in Venezuela and the military strikes that took place there in order for the U.S. to capture Nicolas Maduro and bring him back to the States to face charges on drug trafficking issues. However, of course, a lot of the focus has been on the focus of President Donald Trump. And since Maduro's capture, all he's really been talking about is Venezuelan oil. But in terms of Canada's response, before we get onto the oil aspect, we heard very differing views from some politicians who were denouncing the breach of international laws that we saw here, to others cheering on the U.S. to taking Maduro out, to a sort of middle-of-the-road approach from the government. What did you make of the responses we heard?
Yeah, I think it's important to set kind of a baseline for this. And that baseline is the fact that Canada has not recognized Nicolas Maduro as legitimate president of Venezuela since the election that he effectively stole. This has been our position. It hasn't been controversial. Most of our allies around the world also feel that same way. So that just kind of frames it. So when the U.S. goes in there and snatches him out of his home in Caracas in the dead of night, then there's kind of like a moment where Canadian politicians have to figure out, how are we going to respond to this? Because we wanted the guy gone, but we didn't necessarily want him gone this way. And that's really, I think, where the nuance and the difference between the positions of the federal leaders comes in. So first out of the gate is, well, Pierre Poilievre, I think, actually had a statement out before the prime minister, did not? He came out and he said, I celebrate Donald Trump his decision to do this, and talking about what an awful guy Nicolas Maduro was. Carney's response, a little bit different. He is trying to thread this policy needle between, yes, being pleased that Maduro was gone, that he has been effectively decapitated, or at least the government has been decapitated with his departure, but then also at the same time trying to pivot to this idea that what comes next in Venezuela has to be done in a fair and democratic way. There has to be a transition to democracy. And of course, that's not what we're seeing right now. But then there's all these other kind of implications, policy implications for Canada. First of all, just our general support internationally to the rule of law, and which pretty clearly this was, depending on how you look at it, this was a pretty clear violation of that, going in and taking the leader of another country, although he was not, in our view, Canada's view, he was not properly elected. He was not actually the legitimate leader, but still, this raises concerns. And then also what comes next, and the what comes next part really could have tremendous bearing on Canada. And I know you know this well because you've been covering this all week for our Western affiliates on 24/7 about what this means for the oil industry. If Trump makes good on his promise to resurrect Venezuela's moribund oil industry, to pour tens of billions of dollars of investment into it, start generating more oil, what does that do to the demand in the United States for Western Canada Select coming from Alberta?
Yeah, and on that note, and I will mention the person who was really speaking out against the U.S. intervention was the NDP's Don Davies, who was very quick to call it a breach of international law and criticize there. But on the oil stuff, I mean, the big issue there is the fact that Venezuelan oil is heavy. It's just like Alberta oil. It's hard to process. It's different than some of the oil that you might get in Texas or other places. And so there aren't as many refineries that really do that. And the concern here is that a lot of the refineries on the Gulf Coast, which process about hundreds of thousands of barrels of Alberta crude every day, that would be the end destination of this Venezuelan oil. And the concern is that that could displace the Canadian oil. Now, the question is how much and how quickly that would really happen. It's not quite clear. A lot of analysts say, for the time being, it's not going to be as much of an issue, but we'll have to wait and see what happens with the sanctions decision from the U.S., how it impacts, how much is going to come out. The president has talked a lot on Twitter about, 30 to 50 million barrels that they're going to get from Venezuela. We'll see how quickly that sort of stuff moves and how much it could displace Canadian crude. Another factor out of all of this is most Alberta crude actually goes to refineries in the U.S. Midwest. And so,
Midwest, yeah, it doesn't go down as far south.
Yeah, it's more than 2 million barrels a day that goes down to the U.S. Midwest. So, the bulk of Canadian production is not going to be impacted by this. However, you take that into account with the broader trading issues that we're facing right now, and any dip is going to be problematic for Alberta. And a lot of people are saying this strengthens the need, or the case at least, to try and get that pipeline from the oil sands to the West Coast, which of course BC has been opposed to, and the coastal First Nations as well. So that process is still unfolding, but Pierre Poilievre is using it at this moment, as well as Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, to really try and push the federal government to even further expedite the already fast-tracked approach that the federal government is trying to take on this. So it'll be interesting to see where they go on this, because we haven't seen any commitment from the federal government to further fast-track that, but they're still waiting for a private sector company to come on.
And this is the thing I find really interesting about this situation in Venezuela and vis-a-vis Alberta, is you essentially have similar problems in both places. Not the same problems, but there are similarities. First of all, in order for Venezuela to start exporting huge amounts of increased, I think they're sending about a million barrels a day to the United States. There's talk about getting it up to 3 or 4 million barrels a day. That's a big increase that will require enormous investment by the oil companies in Venezuela's industry. They got to modernize all the equipment. They got to do new drilling. They got to build new pipelines, new port facilities.
And that'll take years.
That will take years, and it will take billions and billions, tens and billions of dollars. In the same way that building the pipeline from Alberta to BC's northwest coast is going to take tens of billions of dollars. Estimates, for anywhere between $10 and $30 billion as a rough ballpark. We look at the cost overruns on the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline. You can probably safely say it's going to be more than even that. So you need a company, a private sector proponent, to come in, possibly an oil company. Maybe it's a TC Energy, maybe it's an Enbridge, maybe it's somebody like that who's going to come in and put up the money for this pipeline to be built. But at the same time, you have a certain amount of political uncertainty in Alberta, because we have this looming question about separatism. And in the same way that much greater extent, you have uncertainty in Venezuela. And the idea that these oil companies are just kind of hanging back, waiting to swoop in at the first opportunity. They make these decisions based on very, very long-term projections about the price of oil, the regulatory environment. Certainly that is a huge factor, of course, in Canada and presumably in Venezuela as well, but also the political stability. And Venezuela is not a politically stable place. By contrast, Alberta, much more politically stable, although this saber rattling from a small number of people in Alberta about separatism probably doesn't help the equation very much. But it is still, obviously, Alberta much more attractive as an investment for those dollars than Venezuela would.
Yeah, and there's also going to be more of a customer base than there currently is for Alberta crude, with China essentially now getting shut out of Venezuelan oil. And the whole point of the pipeline to the west was to open up Asian markets like China. And so that's going to be another conversation moving forward. So a lot to talk about there. And the points you made there about stability are the points that the Prime Minister was trying to make as well, that Alberta oil will still remain competitive because of all the reasons that you had mentioned, that even though there might be price differences and things like that, we will still be competitive as a result of all of that. Now, this wasn't the only issue on the table for the Prime Minister. In fact, it's one of many on the international front. But along with and in the wake of the Venezuela situation, President Donald Trump wasn't sort of stopping at Venezuela, started to toss out threats saying, Mexico, Colombia, you got to get your act together. But then also reiterated his need for Greenland and saying that he wanted to take over Greenland, for national security purposes. And, in recent days, there has been mullings about taking it by force coming out of the White House. What do you make of what the U.S. is threatening? How much stock should we put into that? And what Canada's response has been?
Yeah, I initially didn't think a whole lot of it because we've heard this from Donald Trump really since the inauguration. He's been talking about Greenland. Remember, J.D. Vance, his vice president, flew there and toured the island, and it was very clear from both people who live in Greenland as also and from the Danes as well, who have control over it, that there was no interest in doing this. So that raises the possibility the United States could acquire it by buying it in the manner of the Louisiana Purchase, I guess. Even though this is hundreds of years later, and who knows what the cost would ultimately be, and ultimately the thing is not for sale. And then could they acquire it militarily? Well, if they did, there's really no reason to do that because there already is a U.S. Air Force base on Greenland. They have in the past had as many, I believe, as 17 military bases there in serving different roles. And they have an agreement with the government of Denmark, the Kingdom of Denmark, to allow them to come back if they want. All they would have to do is say, "Oh, we want to build a new runway here that we can land, F-35s on to better protect the North." And very likely the Danes would say, "Yeah, sure, you are our NATO partner after all. Of course, we would have you come in. There are U.S. bases all over Europe, all over Asia, and some in the Middle East. So this would not be unusual for them to increase their presence in Greenland. There's no reason for them to acquire it other than wanting to show on a map that the territorial United States is becoming bigger." But just the threat of it obviously has rattled the Europeans. It's rattled the Danes. Also should be concerning to us because if Trump was actually to make good on this, and you can't imagine any rational human being as president actually effectively launching a military attack against a country that is part of NATO that you are allied with. It would be absolute lunacy. However, Donald Trump is so wildly unpredictable that you never know. So it could happen. And of course, as you know, this is now an issue that Canada has to consider, that if the Americans were to take some kind of military action in Greenland, that is going to change, or should change, our entire stance towards a country that has been our neighbor and ally, closest ally, throughout all of our lives. It would be a complete rethink of Canada's policy towards the United States.
Yeah, and Canada sort of showing solidarity with Denmark. There was a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Danish PM at the meeting in Paris on Ukraine that we'll talk about momentarily. But as well, the announcement that Canada will follow through on something that was announced last year, but we will be setting up a consulate in Greenland, and the Governor General and our Foreign Affairs Minister will be taking a trip out to start that up. Whether that's enough to deter any American aggression,
I don't think it is. Can you imagine? I mean, why do we need a consulate on what is a place that is essentially a gigantic piece of ice? I mean, our backpackers going to be turning up there saying, "Oh, I lost my passport and I ran out of money to pay for the hostel. Could you advance me a couple $100?" I mean, that's what consulates. We have consulates all over the world and throughout the United States too. That's what consulates do. I guess the idea is we don't consider it an independent country, so we can't put an embassy there. But it's purely symbolic. It's a photo op for Anita Anand to go there and do it. I'm really curious to see the architect's drawings of what this thing is going to look like. I'm imagining something not much bigger than a telephone booth. I think that's probably what all we would need there.
All right, so Glenn, the Prime Minister kicked off his week heading to Paris, France, where he was sitting down with a number of allies of Canada, in fact, around 36, who have been dubbed the Coalition of the Willing, mainly European countries, along with Australia and Canada. But they're looking at ways to try and help advance the peace negotiations that are still underway between Ukraine, the U.S., and Russia. And they came to an agreement on a number of security guarantees and a number of other supports for Ukraine to try and alleviate any concerns they have through those peace talks. What was agreed upon? How much do we know about Canada's involvement when it comes to potential military actions on the ground in Ukraine?
Yeah, this is the big question about what kind of role under these security agreements that were agreed to in Paris, what kind of role would Canadian troops play in Ukraine post ceasefire, post peace agreement, post some kind of cessation of hostilities. And the idea, I think, is to create an offer, a peace deal from the Ukrainian side that the Russians cannot turn down. It's saying, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to create this international force to come in to Ukraine that's going to ensure the peace after this deal. It's going to ensure both ways. It's going to be like, sounds like it, kind of what they're proposing sounds not unlike the role that UN peacekeepers have played in the past, the blue helmets. We don't see much about those anymore. And of course, Canada has a really long history of involvement in peacekeeping. In fact, the whole idea was concocted by Lester Pearson, our former Liberal Prime Minister. And so we've had a history of doing this around the world. So it's sensible that we would potentially do this in Ukraine. We have had troops in Ukraine not that long ago. In fact, I think it was back in 2016. I was on a trip with the Prime Minister, Ben Trudeau, to Ukraine, to Lviv in the western part of the country, and watched Canadian soldiers training Ukrainian troops, many of whom I presume went on to serve on the battlefield, or may still be out there right now. So we have a history in the region, but then there is the question of our resources. Do we have enough bodies to take and equipment to take this on? Keeping in mind, we have pretty much approximately a battalion of Canadian troops in Latvia right now, which is a NATO country, forming kind of a bulwark, a tripwire against Russian aggression into the Baltic region. It's sounding like this idea that they've come up with, the Coalition of the Willing has come up with, is going to be a little bit like that. I sort of think of it as kind of NATO light. It's not really NATO. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance and doesn't get the protection from it, but basically creating a pan-European plus us, plus the Australians, possibly New Zealand's, the Kiwis coming in as well, that we would be sort of involved in this role in sort of a NATO defense in future of Ukraine. How the Russians react to this, I don't know. How this will play domestically, if we play this out and see we get to the point we actually put peacekeepers into a theater, it is not always a safe possibility.
Yeah, and that's still potentially a far way off. I know President Zelensky has said that they're 90% of the way there, but that extra 10% are some very critical hangups, such as, control over the Donbass region, a huge industrial area for Ukraine that they don't really want to willingly give up, but Russia says there's no peace deal without us taking over the whole territory. There's some big hangups still on the potential for a ceasefire. So we're still not really close to that deal yet, even though we've maybe never been closer, as President Donald Trump has said, and I think that's quite accurate. But nonetheless, the question as well as a part of these security guarantees is support for Ukraine should Russia invade again after a ceasefire is in place. What does that mean? Is it going to be like Article 5, where it's attack against one is like an attack on everybody? How would they really treat that? So there are still a lot of questions there on that front. And of course, the Prime Minister pointing to our increase in defense spending as one of those ways to sort of build up our military so that we can take part in missions like this, but still unclear, because I believe he said it's still just a possibility that we actually have our own boots on the ground, because there could be other ways in which our military could help respond rather than actually having soldiers on the ground there.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, a training role as they performed in Ukraine before would be sort of a logical one to do, rather than us having, human soldiers on the front lines. In terms of like our military buildup, yeah, we're spending a lot more money on defense now than we were in the past, but it's not necessarily things that are going to be immediately evident on the battlefield or on the peacekeeping field, because things we're spending money on are F-35 fighter jets, many of which are years away from being deployed, new vessels for the Navy, those kinds of things. These are not necessarily going to make a difference right away. The real key is recruitment, just getting people to put the boots on to get on the ground. That's going to be the immediate challenge. The Canadian forces have a huge staffing problem right now, although Carney, of course, has sweetened the pot, increasing the pay levels for lower ranks in the military. That would theoretically will help with recruitment.
And a very interesting situation popped up that has now sort of led to the departure of a key figure in Canadian politics, where ahead of the meeting in Paris, it was announced that Chrystia Freeland, a former deputy prime minister and finance minister for our country, who quit cabinet and is now still an MP for Toronto, the announcement was that she would be taking on an advisory role on the economic development of Ukraine. At the same time, she was holding the role of advising Prime Minister Mark Carney on the reconstruction of Ukraine, while still at that time of the announcement was acting as an MP. So it raised a lot of questions about ethics and the fact that a sitting MP would be working for, even though it's unpaid work, but working for a foreign government in that way. What did you make of this, the handling of these announcements, how it all sort of came out throughout the week?
Ham-handed does not even begin to capture the incompetence in which this whole affair was handled. We should note that today, Friday, is the last day that Chrystia Freeland will continue to sit as an MP. She's been in the House of Commons since, I think, November 2013, when she was heavily recruited by Justin Trudeau and his staff to run as an MP. She'd been a journalist previous to that. They really liked her. They liked the book she'd written, Plutocrats, about the rise of the global elite and rich, and the World Economic Forum we'll be talking about in a moment. But yeah, it really was kind of an inglorious end to her time in federal politics because it was so badly done. And I don't know if Zelensky kind of just jumped the gun here and announced this prematurely before Freeland had a chance to announce that she was taking on this role. And we should say that she is going to be a volunteer. She's not getting paid for this job. She doesn't start the job supposedly until this summer. But the fact that she had accepted the position from Zelensky and was continuing to sit, not as a cabinet minister, as an MP, was still problematic. You just cannot be advising a foreign government, especially a foreign government that is so intimately involved in global affairs right now, while you were continuing to be a member of parliament in Canadian's parliament. You have it's an obvious conflict of interest. It is striking to me that no one in the Carney government or Freeland's office realized what a problem this was going to be, especially when you consider that, according to some of the reporting, I think our colleagues at Canadian Press did, that Carney was notified before Christmas. This wasn't like a big shock to him in the last couple of days. He had advance warning of this. And then when there was an uproar about it, Freeland's response was, okay, well, I'm going to resign in coming weeks. Should have been immediate. Like, you should have just known this is going to be the way you staunch the bleeding on this is you immediately resign. You quit, not a week from now, not a few days from now, quit immediately to take on this role. But it wasn't done that way. And it just really looked badly.
And we're almost at the end of our time here on the podcast, but I wanted to talk as well about the Prime Minister's next trip, which is another international focus trip, because he's off to China and then off to Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. What are going to be the key issues around the China trip? And one that's controversial as well, especially around the Chinese diaspora here in Canada, given the reason why it's been 8 years since we've had the last visit of a prime minister to China, through a lot of controversies and problems and tensions there. But what are the goals for the government? Can they get over the controversial aspect of this trip? And then what are you expecting out of Switzerland as well?
Yeah, it has been a long time, and the relationship has really deteriorated since 2017. That's the last time Justin Trudeau, as the last time a Canadian Prime Minister made an official visit to Beijing, and he met on that trip. I remember being there in the room in the People's Hall when he met with Xi Jinping, and the result of that trip was a pledge by both sides to have regular meetings between the president and the Prime Minister of China and Canada, and that was supposed to happen, I think, biannually, twice a year. They were planning to meet, and they were going to have this discussion to start negotiations towards a framework for negotiating a Canada-China free trade agreement, which would have been huge. Can you imagine if we had gotten to that point now? That would have been enormous. But then everything happened. Yes, all the human rights issues. Then there was the imprisonment the arrest by Canada at the U.S. request of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, the retaliatory arrest of the two Canadians, the two Michaels. That took a long time to work out. And then there has been more recently this trade tensions over our decision to match the Biden administration's move to put 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and as well as further tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, and then their retaliation over canola. So I think that is the focus for Carney and Xi here. Let's not try and come up with some grand pronouncement from this trip. Let's focus on those tariffs that are causing such irritation. Could the EV tariff be relaxed a little bit? What will it take for the Chinese to drop their tariff on canola that is hurting, really, really hurting farmers in Western Canada. What can be done to make some little steps on that instead of working towards a big free trade agreement? So that's really going to be the challenge. But yeah, I mean, there are people who think we should not be negotiating in any way with China, given their human rights records. Still ongoing concerns about that. The fact that they are not a fair competitor, that all their industries, including the EVs that we're tariffing, are effectively subsidized by the government, and their cheap labor, low labor standards, low-cost labor, disregard of environmental standards in some cases. So it's not a balanced playing field that we're dealing with, but Carney needs to come away from this trip with some kind of win, and likely the focus is going to be on trying to arrange something on canola. And I would suspect, generally, when world leaders arrange these visits months in advance, they have a outcome predetermined through negotiations by their officials. So probably we've already got this, but this next week, when Carney goes to Beijing, we'll see more details of it.
Well, I have to end it there. Glenn, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thanks.
And that was Glen McGregor, Parliament Hill reporter for CityNews, and that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram at FrequencyPods or on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone that might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. Maria Castaigne is our lead producer. Diana Kay is the head of strategy and content. Desi Nair is the manager of podcast operations. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney. Thanks for listening.